Also this week, Prince William went against convention by speaking out that all killing must end in Gaza. Joining me now to discuss whether it's such a wise intervention is regular Spectator contributor and royal author Alexander Lahmann. Alexander, thank you for coming on Spectator TV this week. Now, it's a pivotal moment in the Israel-Gaza conflict with a potential ground operation, lots of Western allies warning against, tense moment. And we had a curious intervention this week, perhaps not the one we were expecting ahead of this. Prince William.
Well, there's this royal adage that you should never complain, never explain. I think we should add to that, you should never get involved in international politics, because one of the things about the royal family has been that we've always stayed quiet when it comes to this kind of very loaded political intervention. And what we had from Prince William back in October was we had a statement condemning the terrorist attack that Hamas committed on 7th of October. But now he's gone rather further, and he's essentially suggested that there should be an immediate ceasefire, which is a lot further than the government's going. And this statement came out of nowhere. I mean, nobody was expecting it, and it certainly wasn't as if anyone was calling on him to get involved. So the question that we're all asking is, why did he do it? Did anyone put him up to it? And what's the result of it going to be?
Yeah, it does not feel as though it's the intervention that's going to swing what happens in the coming days. And as you say, you've had Number 10, I think, briefing to suggest that they're not unsupportive of Prince William saying this. But what do you think compelled him to take a stand?
Well, I mean, if you believe the rumours that Ed Balls has been putting about, it's that Lord Cameron put a fatherly hand on his shoulder and said, now's the time for you to get involved, now's the time for you to make a statement. But this is so unprecedented that you can't imagine that anyone, let alone the Foreign Secretary, would actually have thought it was a good idea, because not a single person in this country was thinking, I wonder what Prince William's views on the ceasefire are. And what was interesting is my first response was rather than support of the government, it supported Keir Starmer, because it seemed to be siding quite closely with Starmer's own perspective on what's going to be happening with the ceasefire. So, I mean, you have to ask, where does William stand on all this? Because the statement was quite ambiguous. I mean, he's for his counsel of despair, which is a terrible phrase, but it's also the same one that Rishi Sunak used.
It's curious timing in the sense that obviously King Charles having to step back from full-time royal duties. He did meet with the Prime Minister this week. So is Prince William trying to fill the vacuum left by King Charles? And do we think King Charles would have said this?
But it's funny that in the same way Prince William was at the BAFTAs, which is a completely different kind of event, and I think instinctively one he seems more comfortable with.
He's packing a lot in.
Yeah. Well, he's a busy man, obviously. His wife's not very well at the moment, so he's obviously going to be dealing with all that as well privately. But in terms of his public role, I don't think it was a very good idea. And of course, what you have to ask is who's advising him. And the question is, does Kensington Palace want him to be taking a more proactive role in terms of this stuff? Because if you look at his father, I mean, from probably the early 90s onwards, Charles was getting involved in politics, obviously behind the scenes. He wasn't making any public statements, but the Black Spider memos and things like that very much gave the sense that he was an interventionist prince who wants to have his voice heard. But William's gone a step further because he's making public statements. He's not leaning on the government privately, which is what you might expect him to do. And so you have to ask, is he doing this because he's genuinely interested in the humanitarian impulse? Is he doing it because somebody's told him to? Or is he doing it because he wants to have a higher profile and he wants to essentially put himself out there?
Are you leaning to any of the three?
I would like to keep an open mind at the moment, because, I mean, as ever with any of the royal family, it's quite hard to see what the end game is, because I think that what we have to ask of the royal family, especially with Charles being indisposed, is there a power struggle brewing? Because we can never know for certain. I mean, obviously, the royal family has presented itself for a long time as harmonious and one big happy family, which of course we know they're not. But given all the attendant Prince Harry controversy, I mean, Harry wanting to come back to Britain and offering to step in as being a part-time working royal again, it's as if William's looked at all that and thought, whatever he can do, I can do better. Because I think that obviously the two brothers hate each other, but there's also a sense of competitiveness, and there's been there since childhood. And so you can see that William is probably feeling that he hasn't had a high enough public profile lately, he hasn't been doing enough, and so this is, I think, his way of reasserting himself.
And what's the precedent here for this type of intervention when it comes to the royal family? Because it's hard to imagine the Queen taking this route.
Well, I think you've got to go back to the Duke of Windsor for things like this. I mean, the Duke of Windsor went to this depressed Welsh mining town in 1936, and he said something must be done about this. These men must be got back to work. And obviously, that seems quite mild to us today. But back then, the idea of the king openly taking a political stance was absolutely unheard of. So I think you've got to go back to that to have any sort of comparison, because no, the Queen never said or did anything. I mean, there was obviously her private comments about Scottish independence and indeed Brexit, which
also involved David Cameron, the Scottish independence one. So perhaps there is a common theme there if Ed Balls is correct.
Well, I mean, Ed Balls could very well be correct. He's a very well-connected man. So it's perfectly possible that, yes, that David Cameron did have a hand in the statement, because it's a very terse statement, which I think was obviously the intention, but it does raise more questions than it answers.
And I suppose, in a way, as much as this intervention, I think, has surprised various people this week, it does fit into a trend of the younger royals talking more, being more politically engaged. And in a way, that did slightly begin with King Charles, if we think about his eco-activism. So is this a trend that perhaps is just going to grow and grow?
Well, if you go back to Charles and his Prince of Wales and his eco-activism and his interest in architecture, I mean, they were sincerely held, but they were also quite harmless. I mean, nothing he was doing had any particular insight into the politics of the day. But certainly, I mean, I think that William and Harry, in completely separate ways, are both very happy to be going out there, saying their truth, saying what they believe. And yes, it's only going to get stronger, isn't it? Because once you've let the genie out of the bottle, you can't really have a situation where you're not offering your views. And I think what's very interesting is that we don't know what's going to happen in the conflict. We have absolutely no way of knowing how it's all going to be resolved. But we now know exactly how the man who's going to be king one day feels about it. And I don't rule out the idea there'll be further statements in the future, because in a sense, now he set this precedent, why shouldn't there be?
And you touched on that, but I suppose the final question to you, how then do you think this is going to play out over the next year? Do you think we're going to have Prince William, perhaps inadvertently, now being drawn into a situation where he has to comment more? Or do you think those around him will be saying, be a bit careful?
Well, I wonder if he's enjoying all this, because I feel that for quite a long time, he's felt a bit marginalised, because between his younger brother and his father, he hasn't had much of a chance to let his voice be heard. Because you look at him at the BAFTAs, and obviously I think he's enjoying himself, but that's very much the kind of thing that, say, Prince Edward would be doing. It's not the sort of thing you would expect the heir to the throne to be doing. So getting involved at this sort of level, I think, is actually making him feel like a statesman. And I'd be surprised if this is the last time that we heard from him over the next year, 2 years, 5 years, or whatever in these matters, because I think the adrenaline of the public response is what drives him. And it'd be very interesting to see what comes next.
Thank you for joining Spectator TV today.